To get a better grip on what sense is, a natural question is to ask, well, what is the relationship between sense and the kind of ideas-based theory we saw with Locke? Because you might think that what Frege is really saying is that is this thing that we actually mentioned with Locke. Maybe he has something similar in mind when Locke said a word both means the thing in the world and also means your idea. That was something Locke said. And you might be wondering, you might be thinking, well, maybe Frege is just saying exactly what Locke says there. But in fact, Frege, when he talks about sense, he thinks that this actually is very important to distinguish between sense and ideas. He thinks that sense is there's sort of a similarity, but really the sense of a word is very different from the idea you associate with it. And basically the reason why he wants to make this distinction is because he's exactly worried about the sort of shared understanding problems that we talked about in class. So let's think about this a little bit more carefully. So Frege wants to say that the sense of a name is not the same thing as the idea of the object that the name stands for. So why does he think this? Well, sort of like the way Locke was talking and the presumption we had in class, Frege is thinking that your idea of something, it's sort of like a mental picture or an internal picture of what the object is like. But crucially, he's assuming that different people have different ideas of the same thing. It's very possible that you and I have slightly different pictures or inner pictures or ideas of Superman or Santa Claus. For instance, maybe my idea of Superman really plays up his superpowers. That's what's really obvious. That's what's really salient to me in my inner picture. Maybe to you, the thing that's really salient about Superman is that he's vulnerable to kryptonite or something like that. So we have different sort of internal pictures or ideas of what Superman is like. But remember the last time we saw that, well, once you start saying this, if you think that ideas, if that's what ideas are and that they're part of the meanings of the word, it becomes hard to say how actually we end up understanding the same things by words. If my idea of Superman is just different from your idea of Superman, then how do we understand the same thing by that word? Because if the idea is part of the meaning, then it looks like it just means something slightly different for me than it does for you. And this is something, as we said, we don't want to say. We want to say that the word means exactly the same thing for both of us. Maybe it doesn't even really make sense to talk about it meaning something for a particular person. There just is a meaning out there, and we either grasp it or we don't. That's something we want to be able to say. And this is exactly why Frege doesn't want to say that sense is the same thing as an idea. Because he's very sensitive to this objection. He wants to say that we can all understand the same thing by a particular word. And he thinks that if we think of senses as ideas, that's not something we're going to get. Instead, we're going to get a bad prediction, which is that it's actually very hard or maybe impossible to understand exactly the same thing by a word. Now, something I'll leave for you to think about is just how good this argument is. Is he really right to think that if you think ideas are part of meaning, then inevitably you just have problems explaining how we can understand the same meaning by a word? And something you should also think about is whether appealing to idea types in the way that we mentioned in the lecture last week would be helpful here. But I'm not going to say about that more myself. That's something I want you guys to think about. So Frege this is his reason for thinking that sense is not the same thing as ideas, that senses are something different from ideas. But again, it doesn't really tell us a lot about what ideas are. And it's kind of confusing, actually, that he says this at this point, given that he earlier talks about senses as modes of presentation or ways of thinking about things. And you might say, well, how could it be a way of thinking about something if it's not an idea? And what Frege does is he tries to use an analogy to explain how exactly he's thinking about sense and how exactly he's thinking what the relationship between a sense and an idea is. Because he thinks that there is some relationship, but they're just not the same thing. It's just not that they're exactly the same thing. And this is where he used this analogy of the telescope. So let's draw a picture of what's supposed to be going on in this example. I should say I've sort of added and expanded on this situation a little bit just to make it a bit clearer what exactly Frege had in mind. But this is, I'm pretty confident, what he was thinking of in that passage. So let's suppose that we have three different people, and they're looking at the moon, and they're looking at it through a telescope, or they each have their own telescope. And let's say Alice and Billy are over here, and they're basically looking at it from the same spot. That's Alice, that's Billy. And we also have Carol, who's looking at it from over here. And because she's looking at it from a different spot, it's going to appear sort of different to her. The image that she sees is going to look different. So what happens? Okay, so the light goes into their telescopes, and the moon appears a particular way to them. I'll add some. Now we need to know like a tiny bit about optics to understand this, but hopefully that won't be an obstacle. So what actually happens is that, first of all, the light hits the telescope, and an image forms in the telescope. So that's the image of the moon in the telescope. And then that hits the person's eye, and then there's like a kind of like an image physically on their eye, which then goes into their brain. So first the light hits the telescope, an image forms inside the telescope, and then that image hits the eye. I'll just put another little moon in the head. And the same thing happens in all three cases. So there's an image of the moon in the telescope over here, and then that causes some sort of physical or mental event in the actual people. So remember, this is an analogy, and it's an analogy that's supposed to help us understand the difference between sense and idea. So we have to say, well, what is supposed to be like what in this example? In this example, the image inside the telescope is supposed to give us an analogy for the sense. So the image inside the telescope, that's what the sense is. That's what's supposed to stand for the sense in this analogy. Whereas the ideas in the particular heads are supposed to stand for, well, the ideas. And there's at least two reasons why the image in the telescope is supposed to sort of be like the sense in this example. One reason is because the example sort of shows that it's possible for the very same sense or image in this telescope to be kind of grasped or presented to two different people. So we're imagining that Alice and Billy are looking at the moon from basically exactly the same spot. And that means that the image that forms in their telescopes is going to be the same. When they look at the moon through their telescopes, the same image is going to be there inside the telescope. Whereas a different image is going to be in Carol's because she's looking at it from a different position. So we have two people whose sense is the same. It's the same. The way the moon is presented in the telescope is the same for Alice and Billy, but it's different for Carol. So one thing that this is supposed to have in common with the sense is that we see how if senses are like images in telescopes, we see that the same sense can be grasped by multiple people. Because here, this is the same image in either case, presented to different people. But the further thing that's supposed to be important in this example is that the image in the telescope, that's not like an idea in the head. It's not like it's not a mental event. Rather, it's sort of an objective thing in the world. The image that forms in the telescope, that's something separate from like a thought about the moon, or somebody's idea of the moon. That's something objective and mind independent. And that's something that Frege also seems to think holds for sense too. Though there's crucially an important relationship between sense and thought. Senses are still, in some sense, mind-independent objects. They exist independently of our thoughts. We grasp them just like we see the image in this example. But just like the image in this example is not the same thing as the idea it causes in our heads, the sense that we grasp when we understand a word is not the same thing as the idea in our heads that comes to mind whenever we understand the sense. So that's at least two ways in which this example is supposed to help us understand what senses are like. Just like the image in the telescope, we can see that two people can grasp the same sense and somebody can grasp a different sense if the sense presents the object in a different way. But also, like the images in the telescope, a sense is something that's mind independent. The image in the telescope is not the same thing as the idea in somebody's head that it causes. These are very different things. This is, in some sense, a mind-independent thing. It's something that exists out there independently of our minds. And this is something that Frege thinks holds for sense too. And it is a bit sort of counterintuitive, but he thinks that the sense that we grasp, the thing that we're sort of, in some sense, understand when we know a name, is not the same thing as the idea that comes to mind. And the relationship between those two things is very like the relationship between the idea that forms in your head when you see the image in the telescope. Obviously, they are related, but they're not the same thing. So this is sort of the way Frege wants to think about sense in a way that helps us understand how, on the one hand, they can be something like ways of thinking about an object, while it being possible for two people to grasp the same sense.